Okay, so hopefully we'll be able to get the full screen. If not, it'll be a great presentation anyway. And we do apologize to our speaker that the screen is truncated. He put a lot of time and effort into the pictures and the font and everything that is on the screen. So, but we are excited. Fred Sauceman is no stranger to Kiwanis. And I think every time he comes, we've enjoyed every talk he has. This is a very interesting talk, something that he has watched from beginning to end. He witnessed the growth of the Quillen College of Medicine at ETSU from various perspectives. As a radio and television news reporter in the 70s, he covered a lot of the political complications that led to the college's creation and a lot of the uncertainty in the early days. So he was able to watch a lot of that. And when he was hired as the head to head up the University Relations Division at ETSU in '85, he began really telling a lot of the stories. And I think everyone here has been impacted at some point in our time with our doctors, physicians, with the value that the ETSU College of Medicine has provided. And he was able to tell the early on stories of that, which is very important to keep everything rolling. So in the early 2000s, he began to piece together the notes that were left by President Emeritus Dr. D.P. Culp, and that is the father of Jim Culp, who is one of our guests, who intended to tell this story. So Fred was able to work with those notes and really piece together quite a bit of the story. He has built upon Dr. Culp's beginning and created a book over 40,000 words, history of the political battle. And today he's going to highlight and share a lot of the aspects of that history. He himself is a graduate of ETSU, receiving a Bachelor's of Arts degree in English and History in 1978, a Master of Arts in English in 1980, and he was present in May of '82 when the very first class of graduates earned their MDs from the ETSU College of Medicine. So let's give Fred a very good Kiwanis welcome.
All right, thank you very much for having me today. We will overcome these technical issues. I spoke last summer at Emory and Henry, and in the beautiful McLaughlin Auditorium in that theater, I had the PowerPoint set up. It was running perfectly. The microphone sounded good. We were ready to go, and the power went out. I don't think there's any question that the medical school campaign was the best example of regional cooperation we have ever seen. As was mentioned, about 20 years ago, I started talking to some of the major figures in this movement, and fortunately recorded those conversations and turned all that material, based largely on what Dr. Culp put together, into a 40,000 word book that only tells the story of the political battle that led to the creation of the College of Medicine. It doesn't tell the history from '82 on. It tells the history of that political fight, which shows you how deep that was in Tennessee. There were death threats flying around throughout these years, sadly enough. But the fact that we have graduated 2,500 MDs and that at least half of those are practicing here in Tennessee is proof that visionaries like D.P. Culp and Jimmy Quillen and Charles Allen and P.L. Robinson were right all along. It took a lot of courage. Dr. Culp, who was the fourth president, he was president from 1968 to 1977, put his job on the line. He defied his boss, the governor of Tennessee, Winfield Dunn. And we've lost a couple of participants in this story, in this battle here in the last few months. As you might know, shortly before I was scheduled to come here to talk, Winfield Dunn died at the age of 97. And another unsung hero of this story is a journalist, a man named Henry Samples, who worked for what was then the Johnson City Press Chronicle. Carl Jones, the publisher of that newspaper, Carl A. Jones, made a commitment to support this medical school movement, and he put teeth behind that commitment. He put money behind that commitment. He put personnel behind that commitment and sent Henry Samples to Nashville, Tennessee in January of 1974. He'd been there on and off before, but pretty much told Henry, you stay here and cover this med school question every day. And that's what happened from January of 74 until March of 74 when the bill passed. All right. Merrill Moore, who was the longtime anchor for Channel 5, WCYB in Bristol, told me of all the stories that he had covered in his career, this was the most significant. Tom Hodge, who was the editorial director at the Johnson City Press Chronicle when he retired or died in 2004, before he passed away, told me that the clip file at the Johnson City Press Chronicle for the medical school creation was the thickest clip file that they had. So this was a grassroots movement. Not to get political, but you can see the power of grassroots movements in what happened this past Tuesday. This was a grassroots movement. When Dr. Culp was contemplating taking this job, he and Martha and I don't know how many of the children made that trip, but they drove to Johnson City from Alabama to check things out. And Dr. Culp wasn't totally sure he was going to take this job. He had planned to stay at Montevallo until, as he put it, the pine box came calling. It was a long time before that pine box came calling. So he and the Culp family drive to Johnson City. And to illustrate the grassroots nature of this campaign, Dr. Culp stops at a gas station. We called them filling stations then because somebody actually came out and filled your tank. The attendant noticed the Alabama tags on the car and immediately said, you know, we're going to get a medical school. From a gas station attendant. The gas station attendant says to Dr. Culp, you know, the University of Tennessee is going to fight us. They're in for one hell of a fight. Dr. Culp goes to the fire department to talk to folks. And the people who were staffing the fire department that day started talking, without him bringing it up, started talking about a new medical school for East Tennessee State University. So that told him this movement had some potential. A little bit later, some of you may remember Jim Calogris. This is a great illustration of the grassroots nature of this movement. Jim Calogris ran the Peerless restaurant in Johnson City, known for its outstanding steaks. And Jim gets word that Senator Brown Ayers from Knoxville, Tennessee, is coming up to eat at the Peerless. Brown Ayers, I believe, was the grandson of the University of Tennessee president. Brown Ayers and a couple of his legislative colleagues walk in the door of the Peerless, where there was a big sign outside supporting the ETSU Med School. And Jim Calogris recognizes Brown Ayers. And Calogris says, I understand you are against our new medical school here at ETSU. Brown Ayers says, yes, that's true. Jim Calogris says, well, you're not going to eat in our restaurant tonight. So after that drive from Knoxville, Brown Ayers is turned away. This was a David and Goliath battle without question. Jim and I were talking about what this story might mean to folks today. I'm glad to revive it because it should mean a lot. ETSU, Dr. Culp, and the Upper East Tennessee legislators defied just about every organization in Tennessee that you could think of. The Tennessee Medical Association opposed the medical school for ETSU. Can you imagine that? The Board of Regents, to which Dr. Culp reported, opposed the medical school. The Tennessee Higher Education Commission, directed at the time by a man named John Folger, opposed the medical school. Folger claimed that we were on the verge of an oversupply of doctors. That's what we had to fight. This medical school concept goes back a little farther than you might expect, or you might predict. I'm convinced that it was talked about in the 1950s. I know that there was a meeting to discuss it on the campus of ETSC at the time in 1960. I found a document in the archives of Appalachia, one of this area's greatest institutions, by the way. I spent a lot of time in there. I found a document written by President Bergen Dossett, who was Dr. Culp's predecessor. Dossett was president from 1949 to 1968. And in that document, Dossett vaguely mentions the need for another state-supported medical school in Tennessee. He doesn't say Johnson City. He was pretty politically astute. He didn't want to get out in front of the issue too far too quickly. But it's in that November 1961 document. I'm sure Dossett had conversations with R.H. Hutchison, who was the Commissioner of Health in Tennessee, when Dossett was Commissioner of Education. I know they talked about a new med school for our state. And one of the reasons we got it was the fact that we had a man named John Lamb on our campus, whose name is on the College of Health. John Lamb built up this College of Health with programs like speech-language pathology, health education, dental hygiene. And the existence of that college definitely played a major role in the creation of the medical school. That first meeting I mentioned was on December the 10th, 1960. It wasn't even publicized, wasn't even in the newspaper. The heroes of this movement are remarkable because these are folks who did other things. They weren't career politicians. One of them was Dr. Charles Ed Allen, who was barely out of medical school, trying to get a medical practice started. But immediately, being a native of Irwin, saw a need for more doctors in this region. That quote in the first slide that you didn't see, closer to Canada than Memphis, came directly from Charles Allen, because he was at home one night as this campaign was getting started, and he got out a compass, you know, the kind with the sharp point and the pencil, and he got a map out. And he started drawing circles. And he figured out that if you started a car out in Johnson City, headed that car to Memphis, and headed another car to Johnson City, the Canada car, headed that other car to Canada, the Canada car would get there first. We were closer to Canada, still are, of course, than to Memphis. Dr. Allen had his facts and figures always at hand. He pointed out that this area had a population density of 1 million people within a 50-mile radius. Almost 4 million within 100 miles. Nationally at the time, this was the early 60s, there were 140 doctors per 100,000 people. Upper East Tennessee, that number dropped to 70, half that many doctors. 70 doctors per 100,000 people. If you move out a few counties and incorporate some of the adjacent counties, the figure dropped even further. 40 doctors per 100,000 people. Despite what John Folger at the Higher Education Commission said, we were in a crisis. And Dr. Allen knew that. Another hero of the story was a dairy farmer. He wasn't a professional politician at all. His name was Palma L. Robinson, P.L. Robinson, from Jonesboro, Tennessee. He and his wife, Ruth, who would later take her husband's seat after his death in the Tennessee State House of Representatives, weren't politicians. They were working people. They were farmers. But P.L. Robinson understood the critical value of having more doctors for our region and managed somehow with Ruth to keep that dairy farm going while trekking back and forth to Nashville to campaign for this med school. Unfortunately, I was not able to interview PL because he died in the early 80s, long before I started this project. But I did interview his wife, Ruth. In the Senate, there was a grocer by the name of Marshall T. Nave from Elizabethton, Tennessee. The Senate during this political fight was really never in question. It was the House. Marshall Nave, according to Charles Allen, somehow lined up support in the Senate, and it never wavered. So you've got a grocer, you've got a dairy farmer, you've got a doctor. That just shows you the grassroots nature of this movement. March 1st, 1966 was the first public mention of the idea in the Johnson City Press Chronicle. And the first state appropriation, you won't believe how much it was. $2,500. Dr. Allen and members of the local medical association had formed an organization called ARCHA, Appalachian Regional Center for the Healing Arts. They needed an entity to start drawing down funds, and that was it. And the first appropriation occurred on May the 27th, 1967. Now, put yourself back into the 1960s politically. Tennessee is known as a red state now. That was not the case in the 1960s. 2/3 of the state, West and Middle Tennessee, were predominantly Democratic. Upper East Tennessee, predominantly Republican. That started to change in the 60s. Started to change with the election of Howard H. Baker Jr. from Huntsville, Tennessee to the U.S. Senate in 1966. And then 4 years later, Bill Brock from Chattanooga is elected to the other Senate seat. So by 1970, we have two Republican U.S. senators representing Tennessee. Also in that 1970 election, something pretty significant happened that held out promise for us here in East Tennessee. A promise that was dashed eventually, but we elect our first Republican governor in 50 years. We had not had a Republican governor since Alf Taylor from Carter County, Tennessee, was elected to that position in 1920. So when Winfield Dunn is elected in November 1970 to take office in January 1971, elation in Upper East Tennessee. Hey, we've got somebody who will advocate for this cause. Winfield Dunn was from Mississippi. Meridian, educated at the University of Mississippi in Oxford with a DDS, a dental degree from the University of Tennessee in Memphis. By the way, I gave a talk on Bergen-Dosset the other night, over an hour long. It's on the university's YouTube channel. If you have a spare hour or 15 minutes sometime, look at it. I point out in that talk that governors born in Mississippi traditionally have not been very kind to ETSU. Buford Ellington being a case in point. Buford Ellington fought our movement to become ETSU. We became ETSU in 1963. Of course, another hero is the man whose name is on the school now, James H. Jimmy Quillen from right here in Kingsport. Had it not been for Jimmy Quillen, the federal funds that we got to create that school would not have been drawn down, and we never would have had it. We never would have had it without the Teague-Cranston legislation that created medical schools in conjunction with VA facilities. A little bit more about this campaign. Do you all remember, if you're around in 1971, what was called the Big Party? Jim probably remembers this. Members of the Tennessee General Assembly were brought from Nashville to Johnson City to tour the campus, to tour the VA. David Torbett from Sullivan County headed that up. David Torbett was a judge and a member of the Tennessee House at one time. This occurred in November of '71, when all these legislators were brought to Johnson City. Jim Calogris fed them steaks. The Memphis paper called it the biggest lobbying effort undertaken by the citizens of the state. Now, the med school concept was studied to death. Consultant after consultant after consultant, most of whom said it was a good idea, including a group early on that included a man named Dr. William Harlan from the University of Kentucky. But Dunn commissions his own study. And the Harlan report was issued in January of 1972. And it was a bombshell. The Harlan report said, essentially, not only do we not need another medical school, we certainly don't need it in Johnson City, Tennessee. Yeah. If funding is ever available for a new medical school, the first choice should be Knoxville, the Harlan report said. The second choice should be Chattanooga, of all places. And the Tri-Cities, a distant third. I wish I had images to show you, because what the Johnson City Press did in response to that Harlan report was, what kind of adjective should I use? Astounding, I think, is appropriate. Carl Jones goes to the advertising department and has an artist in the advertising department draw a big cow. And the cow is all across the front page under the headline, "Area Pulls Hind Tit on Med School." Paper got a lot of complaints about the use of that word in the headline, as you can imagine. But by gosh, it got the point across. The cow's head is over West Tennessee. The cow's hindquarters are over East Tennessee. And right above the cow's body, it says, "Well done, D-U-N-N." Carl Jones mailed 100 copies of that paper to the governor's mansion in Nashville, Tennessee. Jimmy Quillen's rejoinder was also classic. In an official news release from the U.S. Congress, Jimmy Quillen calls the Harlan Report Tommy rot. When I told this story to some younger folks the other day, somebody asked me what Tommy rot was. I said, well, think B-U-L-L with that other four-letter word attached to it. Carl Jones certainly was one of the heroes in this movement. Were it not for Carl A. Jones, we wouldn't have had the med school. I'll tell you another one from right here in Kingsport. If you go through the archives and look at all this material, some of the most erudite, articulate editorials, 100% accurate, that were written during this period were written by a man named Bill Freehoff. I used to work with him at WKPT. Bill Freehoff was a Neiman Fellow at Harvard University, working here in Kingsport. His editorials are spot on. They're accurate. They're beautiful. In 1972, ETSU ships a whole busload of students to Nashville to show our support of the med school. Dunn had commissioned Maxie Jarman, who had run against him in the primary, to do a blue ribbon study on the state budget, the economic picture in Tennessee. You remember Maxie Jarman? You remember Jarman Shoes? That was his company. So Dunn hires Maxie Jarman to do this report. And on February 23rd, 1972, Maxie Jarman presents his report to the legislature. And Dr. Culp called it a bombshell because Maxie Jarman advocated for a new med school for ETSU. October 24th, 1972, Nixon signs the Teague-Cranston bill. May 1st, 1973, we get $100,000 for planning under the direction of 24 different consultants. All right, there's a deadline for application for Teague-Cranston funds, right? We've got to get this med school approved through our legislature to get those federal funds. So here's the battle. February 4th, 1974, the plan for a freestanding medical school was introduced into both houses of the Tennessee General Assembly. Meanwhile, the Board of Regents and the Higher Education Commission are saying, we want ETSU and UT to cooperate. We want more graduate programs. We want more primary care sites. We don't want a new med school. Comes up for a vote on February the 18th, 1974. The House vote is too short. Bob Good told me, Bob Good was a representative from Washington County. Bob Good told me Speaker Ned Ray McWhirter from West Tennessee walked by his desk in the chamber and said, don't cry, boys. We're going to run this bill again. There had been a Memphis legislator who had stayed out of the vote. He was in the bathroom or something. And McWhirter said, and as for our friend from Memphis, he won't be returning to the legislature again. And McWhirter was right. There were lots of threats going on. Long after this was over, well, during the battle, Henry Loeb, who was the mayor of Memphis, said to McWhirter, if you support this med school, I'm going to get you out of politics. You'll never be reelected to anything. Henry Loeb tells McWhirter that. And you know the end of that story, which I'll get to in a minute. All right. February 28th, the General Assembly authorizes ETSU to create a med school. March 5th, Dunn vetoes the bill. March 6th, the bill is overridden by the Senate. March 12th, the House overrides the veto. P.L. Robinson was a veteran of the Battle of the Bulge and the Normandy invasion. He said, I've never felt this kind of pressure. He said that. Dunn's transportation commissioner was from Washington County. Dunn had him threaten area communities that the road work wasn't going to be done if their representatives voted for this med school. By March 19th, THEC and the Board of Regents fell in line, and we were on our way. Governor Ray Blanton has a bad reputation, but Governor Ray Blanton, who was in office from 75 to 79, helped save this med school. He was able to get an appropriation from the Appalachian Regional Commission of about $900,000 when we had no budget. One of the most dramatic days of this campaign, and I'll wrap it up, was on June the 30th, 1977. Dr. Culp had gotten an extension. He had planned to retire, but he wanted to see this through. His last day in office was June 30th, 1977. And his administrative assistant, at the end of the day, when the offices closed at 5 o'clock, at 4:35 that afternoon, said, "There's a telegram here from Western Union. We have gotten provisional accreditation from the Liaison Committee on Medical Education to create a medical school for East Tennessee State University."